Please join me in welcoming Anthony Appiah and Annette Gordon-Reed.
Well, here we are.
Here we are.
This is a wonderful book. It's an important topic, and I enjoyed reading it very much. To start off, tell us, what was the genesis of the book? I mean, you've written about identity a couple of times. Why do you think it's important to write about this now, at this particular moment?
Well, as you and I both know, the answer to the question why you wrote a book now begins at least 4 or 5 years ago, since that's about how long it takes to make a book. But I mean, the sort of crystallizing moment, as it were, was a conversation I had with the woman who runs the home service of the BBC, we were talking about whether I could give the Wreath lectures in England. And I thought, if I were going to talk, and that's an audience of millions in England and around the world, and I thought if there was a topic that I could speak about to that audience, what would it be? It had to be something that was, I think it had to be something that had kind of narrative components, that could be understood by telling stories, as well as by making arguments. And it had to be something that I knew about. and that I could sort of tell. And between us, I think we settled pretty quickly on the topic of identity. And so I did, a couple of years ago, give a few lectures on the World Service, and it was fun on the BBC, both on the Home Service and the World Service, these old imperial names for bits of the BBC. And they suggested, because it was going to be broadcast around the world, that I should do it in various places. So I gave a lecture in London, one in Glasgow, one in Accra in Ghana, and then one in New York. And I picked 4 topics. Out of the range of topics you might pick for talking about identity, I picked religion, nationality, culture, and race. Then I had sort of 2 years to turn it into a book, and so I added more about those, but I also put in a sort of a discussion at the start of the very idea of identity, and a discussion later on about class, which seems like a form of identity that we ought to think about. And along the way, other things are sort of sprinkled in. But that was the genesis of it. It was thinking, what's a topic that I know something about that should be of interest to a very wide global audience, and that seemed like it.
So why do you think it's important for us? You mentioned in the book the necessity of rethinking identity. Why must we rethink identity?
Well, I think the answer is different for each of the identities, in the sense that what they have in common is that all of them tend to involve some central set of misunderstandings. That's why it's called the lies that bind.
The lies that bind.
I don't want to deny that identities bind, and I don't want to deny that they can be used for good. But many of them, well, all of the ones that I discuss, our ordinary thinking about them tends to involve some error. And so one reason for rethinking is just if you have an important concept and you're getting something wrong about it, it might be better to get it right. So just as it were, intellectual hygiene. But I think that another reason is that some of these errors actually get in the way of important possibilities, political possibilities, social possibilities. People misunderstand an identity, and it stops them from seeing something in the world that could be improved. It's not just a matter of hygiene intellectually, it's a matter of trying to make the world better.
And you said that the purpose of this book is to start a conversation about it. What would the conversation look like, and who would it be among?
Well, the great thing about identity is that it's basically everybody's topic.
Yeah.
You can. I start the book with a story about taxi drivers, asking me sort of what I am. I mean, I look one way, I talk another way. Who am I, kind of thing. And that's happened to me literally twice in the last 2 weeks. In fact, it happened to me yesterday. An Egyptian Uber driver yesterday asked me where I was from. And then he said, when I was beginning to explain, he said, "You know, you look Egyptian." And then I was asked by a Sikh driver a couple of weeks ago. I suppose he thought I might be a bad Sikh.
A bad Sikh. Sikh without your turban.
Cut my hair.
With a headdress.
No beard. So you know, people think about these things. You can talk about them with almost anybody. And as I say, it's different for different identities what the thing is to talk about. But I do think that these are topics that it's useful to talk about. I find students like to talk about them. But I think you could have conversations about them in as it were, bars and anywhere. You could even have conversations about them on television, which is one of the few places where conversations don't seem to be able to happen at the moment.
Well, it's interesting because when people think about identity now, before I read your book, and people have been talking a great deal about identity, but they're talking about identity politics. And it's been something that has been identified as a problem, particularly for the Democratic Party. I mean, I always find that interesting because it sort of assumes that identity just sort of popped up in the last decade,
Yes.
and identity politics just popped up in the last decade, when in fact, I mean, you look to the Naturalization Act of 1790 in the United States that said, only free white people could become citizens. I mean, that's a form of identity politics. What makes it so special now that other groups are engaging in all of this? So is there a relationship between your work? Do you see a relationship between your work and this discussion of identity politics? I mean, you talk about white nationalism and the 19th century and scientific racism and so forth, but this is different, right? This is underrepresented groups who have put their interests into the political mix are now saying, this is a problem, hold back on that, because that's identity politics and it is seen as something negative.
Right. So the expression identity politics is one of those expressions for something that was produced by its enemies. So as it were, it's built into the very idea of identity politics that it has to be bad. But if you took the notion of identity politics in the most natural way, then in my view, once you have large-scale polities, you have to have identity politics. Because unlike the way Aristotle imagined the polis with 10,000 citizens who could in principle get to know each other, all modern states are enormous, and they're all communities of strangers. So identities, national identities, partisan identities, religious identities, these are the only ways in which we can connect effectively for political purposes with large populations of strangers. So in that sense, all politics has to be identity politics. It has to be politics in which identities are mobilized. So in the current moment, when people object to identity politics, I think they're objecting to one of the things they're objecting to, and this is a point that Fukuyama makes in his book about identity, which is coming out about now too. One of the things they're objecting to is focusing on demands for what philosophers, going back to Hegel, have called recognition, a politics which is about respect for people through their identities. Now, I don't know why you should be against that. It seems to be perfectly reasonable for people, especially people of previously derogated identities, to ask for public respect, both from the state and from other people in society. That seems like, as it were, the minimum you should do to clear up the mess made by racism and homophobia and sexism and Islamophobia. That seems like the minimum you could do, is to say, well, we're not going to we're going to stop looking down on you as a black person, as a woman, as a gay person, as a Muslim. We're going to start going eye to eye with you, looking at you as equals. That seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to ask for. I think that, so that doesn't seem to me like a good thing to object to. I think it is important that when previously derogated groups ask for things, recognition isn't the only thing they're asking for, right? They're asking for equal pay. They're asking for equal rights. They're asking for the vote, right? They're asking for things that are not about recognition. They're about practical things that anyone would want to have. And again, that seems to me perfectly reasonable. Why shouldn't people who've been denied the vote or civil rights ask for them? That seems perfectly sensible to me. Indeed, it would be weird to think that that wasn't a reasonable form of politics, to ask the state to treat me properly, and me and my kind, whatever my kind is that I've been derogated under. So again, I find it a bit difficult to know why you should be against that. So in the end, I think the thought that I can get some grip on is that is an old left thought. It's that what really matters is money and income and wealth and all that, and that in focusing on seeking respect for these previously derogated groups and continuingly to be derogated groups, you've lost track of the fact that you should be focused on raising the economic level of the worst off. I am willing, with that I agree. I mean, that is to say, I don't agree that there's that these are alternatives, that you must do one or the other. I think, you can walk and chew gum. You can do two things at once. I think we have neglected questions of class politics. We have neglected the questions. My own view is I don't know if this will put you off me, but I'm not an egalitarian. I don't think that what matters is equality in these things.
Oh my goodness.
I think in these things.
Stop right there. All men are created equal.
All men are created equal, but that doesn't mean they have to
I write about a person who said that. So,
I know, yes.
So this is interesting. You're not an egalitarian. So could you explain that?
About money and wealth. I don't think that the kind of equality that matters is having the same amount of stuff.
Okay.
I think that what really matters in the economic domain is having enough. Mm-hmm. And we have too many people in the world and in our country who don't have enough. Mm-hmm. And that we haven't focused on. And especially because globalization of the economy and the opening of the world economy and the great growth in world trade has moved jobs and has displaced the lives of some people in this country. And those people, we should have been thinking about them all along. We should have been thinking about them not because they were a nuisance or because they were going to vote for somebody we didn't want them to vote for, but because they're fellow citizens of ours whose circumstances have been made bad by an important change in the world, which has been good for many, many people. It's been good for a lot of people. It's been good for hundreds of millions of Chinese. It's taken more people out of poverty in the last decade or two than we've done in the whole of human history before now. That's great. And I myself think that's wonderful. I think everybody, American, Chinese, German, Ghanaian, should be in favor of taking people out of poverty wherever they are on the planet. But it's been at the cost of displacement for some people. And a decent society, seeing that, would work to try and improve the circumstances of those displaced people, to give them a sense that this is a country that cares about them and that is trying to guarantee them and their families a decent existence. I think that's right, and we haven't done enough of that, and this is a complaint reasonably made against both parties. It's a reasonable complaint against the Republican Party, and it's a reasonable complaint against the Democratic Party that we didn't do enough of that over the last few decades, as the material conditions of the worst off basically have settled into a sort of low level, and meanwhile that globalization has produced trillions of dollars of new wealth, and most of it's gone to the top 20% of the population, and within the top 20% to the top 1%, and within the top 1% to the top 0.1%. So that's all that wealth could have been used, some of it, to invest in communities where jobs had gone away, these communities are rural and urban, black and white, and Hispanic, and so on. They're not just one identity group, and we should have done that. So I agree with that. And if that's a part of what people mean by complaining that identity politics has distracted us from something else, okay, I accept that. But I don't think that that's a problem that you could say that was a problem that distinguishes the Democratic Party from the Republican Party. It's a failure of our elites, of all parties, to think seriously about the circumstances of the worst off in our own society. And as I say, I think a decent society wants to make sure that everybody has enough. And we haven't done that. We haven't been focused on that.
Do you think your background uniquely qualifies you to talk about identity? And that, well, I do this to my students. I ask multiple questions, so I should do one at a time. One at a time. Do you think that your background uniquely qualifies you to talk about identity or makes you more interested in it? Nobody ever asks me what I am.
Right.
I mean, people ask me where I'm from. For some reason, people don't think that I'm a native New Yorker. So I get asked that question quite a bit. They don't think I'm from another country. They think I must be from some other state or some other place. So I don't have the experience. I've always known I'm a black woman in America. And so I don't go on or think a lot about identity. So
yeah, I think I was bound to have more thoughts about this than most people because I have, my father came from Ghana, my mother from England. They were both from elite backgrounds. My uncle and great-uncle were kings of Asante, and my grandfather and great-grandfather were members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, respectively. And members of government, not just members of Parliament, but, Chancellor of the Exchequer and presidents of the Board of Trade. And so it's rather unusual to have that combination of things in your background. So it's not surprising that people ask me sort of what I am. And I'm also gay, which has added some complexities, more perhaps earlier in my life than now, and more perhaps in Ghana than in England or the United States, but still some complexity. And I think, so I was bound to think about it. I also I was very devout Christian when young, and so my religious background is very important to my sense of who I am, even though I'm no longer a theist. So I think it's sort of natural for me to think about these things, and people in my family, so my parents are these, people who came up from very far apart, thousands of miles apart, but my sisters are married to a Nigerian and a Norwegian, and their children are married to Russians and Namibians and various other people. So we're a pretty diverse lot by using, one lot of standards of diversity. I have Jewish cousins, I have Muslim cousins, I have Christian cousins, I have Christian siblings. So that's not terribly common. On the other hand, it's becoming more common. Even within the United States, the number of families in which are religiously diverse has grown enormously over the last half century. This is a point that Bob Putnam makes in his book, American Grace, about American religious life. And there are more and more people who have multinational backgrounds. There are more and more interracial marriages in the United States. I have to remind my students that my parents' marriage was illegal in the state of Virginia until I was 15. So, these things are changing. My husband's got a Chinese brother-in-law. So there's an American who married somebody from thousands and thousands of miles away. So I think that it's becoming more common, but it was sort of inevitable. And then in combination with that, the fact that I grew up about half in Ghana and half in England and then came here in my 20s. So again, people asking you who you are, why do you talk like that, and so on, was sort of inevitable. And also I was trying to figure out the United States. My experience of race was an African experience and a British experience. Those are different from the United States.
What do you think, what was the biggest difference? When did you come here?
I came in the early 80s.
Okay.
So my first great puzzlement about the United States was Ronald Reagan. I found completely impossible to make sense of what he was about. So, yeah, I mean, one thing was in Africa, being black doesn't give you anything but in particular when you meet somebody. Yeah. Here it does, and one of the great privileges of my life coming here was being welcomed into African American families because I was black, right? I mean, I didn't know anything about, I knew about African American life. Everybody in the world knows about African American life. We have some of the greatest writers are African American, so I grew up reading Richard Wright and James Baldwin. Actually, Richard Wright visited us when I was a child in Ghana. So I didn't know nothing, but I had no everyday experience of race in America. And that was one of the things, anyway, for me, that has been one of the great sort of privileges of my Americanization was coming to make friends with black people. And all we had in common, I mean, you always have lots of things in common with everybody, but the main thing we had in common, as it were, as a starting point, was just that we were both black. And that was kind of, that doesn't work in Africa. You can't say, hey, we're both black, because, first of all, I'm brown, I'm not black in Africa. But second, everybody on both sides of the Afghan war was black. So that was one big thing. I had some theoretical appreciation of this, as I say, because my father was a friend of Du Bois's, who died in Ghana as a Ghanaian citizen. So I was raised in the Pan-Africanist context. So I knew, and I read Richard Wright and James Baldwin, as I said, and other people, African-American writers. But there's a difference between a kind of theoretical grasp and then walking up the street in New Haven into the part of town that I was living in when I first came as a graduate student, which turned out, I mean, it wasn't, I didn't know what I was doing. So I turned out I was living in a black neighborhood at that point, and I walked around at night and felt perfectly safe, and a lot of the other graduate students around told me I was crazy to walk around at night in that part of town, but nothing ever happened to me. So that sort of experience, I think, is the sort of thing that makes you think, what's going on here?
The difference between the sort of welcoming a black community, a group of people, because of the numbers and the experiences
being a minority.
and so forth. Yeah, being a minority. Yeah, that's very different, obviously, than it would be in Ghana, and a different experience in England as well. You talk a little bit about, I'm thinking of some of the discussions about identity that are going on here at the time, the notion of cultural appropriation. And you say that it should not be used, that phrase should not be used as, I think the word used, an indictment, not as an indictment. Talk a little bit about that. Do you, well, again, I'll start. One question at a time. This is me. I'm stopping myself from going from question to question.
People talked about the cultural appropriation in the context of, as it were, cultural things that matter, things that are valuable. Nobody worries about stealing a bad idea or a bad song or a stupid dance. So this is about how to think properly about the kinds of culture that matter to us, right? And the kinds of culture that matter to us have always been hybrid, borrowed, stolen, moved across boundaries. Shakespeare takes his stories from ancient Rome. One of his leading characters is a Danish prince, and it's based on a story that comes from Denmark. He didn't just make it up. He took the sonnet form from Petrarch, who was an Italian, had to change it because Italian verse and English verse work differently because the languages are different, and so on. Basho takes Buddhist ideas and a Chinese script and writes haiku, the great 17th century poetic form from Japan. There's lots of French in the novels of Tolstoy. So, and you could make the same point about music. There are Andean musical ideas in Monteverdi and so on. I mean, these are just things that anybody who studies these things will tell you. One of the cases that I discuss a bit in the book is the deep interdependence of our understanding of the ancient Greek classical world on the understanding of it that was developed by the Arabs during the so-called European Dark Ages, which were not so dark. But they were a time when, for example, Aristotle was missing from much of the conversation, and in the form of Aristotle that was there was very Catholicized, very. It was St. Thomas. So I just think that if you care about those things, you wouldn't want to stop that kind of hybridity. You wouldn't want to stop that kind of coming and going. However, of course, when people are working across cultures, there are many possibilities of bad behavior. One is stealing, not. I take a musical idea. I work with it from some people from in a world music context, say some people in a valley somewhere who don't know much about the world. I don't pay them. I take their ideas, I go away, I get rich making music in the world. Well, that seems kind of unfair. I've exploited somebody. That's not about cultural appropriation. That's about not respectfully treating people who work with you to produce something. And it's a kind of theft. If you take a cultural form that has a deep meaning for one group and you play around with it, that's insulting. That's bad. So I don't mean that nothing that's objected to under the rubric of cultural appropriation is bad. I just mean that what's bad about it is, in my view, never that culture was taken by a person of one identity and used by somebody of another identity. There may be bad karma in that exchange, but what's wrong with the exchange, in my view, is never that, oh, this person over here shouldn't have used this over there because the culture belongs to them. And that's in part because I think of the forms of culture that are most valuable in this sense, in this Arnoldian sense of literature and the arts, not in the anthropological sense. I think of what's most valuable as produced. It's not produced or owned by groups, by identities. We relate to it through our identities, but it doesn't belong to. Shakespeare doesn't belong to people of English descent. Goethe doesn't belong to people of German descent. And anyway, if he did, they'd have to send back half of Goethe to Persia, since one of Goethe's great influences was Hafiz, who was a Persian poet. So I'm not saying that when people complain about cultural appropriation, they're always complaining about something that's just fine. I'm saying that it's the wrong analysis of what's wrong in these cases, and that if you bought the analysis, you'd end up stopping a lot of really important and beautiful things. Like, for example, my English mother's publication of Ghanaian folktales for English and American children to read so they could understand something about the lives of people in Ghana. As a white woman appropriating black culture. No. That's my mother listening to the fathers my Ghanaian father told me and publishing a book called Tales of an Asante Father. That's fine.
Cross-cultural, respectful.
Respectful
cross-cultural. So the problem is appropriation is cultural borrowing, cultural melding, those kinds of things. Yes. But anything that is disrespectful, that's the problem.
I mean, I think in the background, of course, talk of appropriation implies a kind of way of thinking about, say, Shakespeare as a kind of commodity. I don't like that either. I don't think the way to think about Shakespeare is as a kind of property that belongs to some people, doesn't belong to other people, that some people have rights to and other people don't. I don't think that's a good way to think about anything.
Yeah. Well, talk a little. You mentioned Shakespeare, and one of the things that I think about the whole conception of the Western world, that's what's been allowed, is people who are not writers, people who may not be particularly talented in any kind of way, but who are white, to claim the mantle of a connection to Shakespeare that I don't have or that you don't have, for example. Yes. Talk a little bit about the concept of the West. I found that a fascinating part of the book because it's something that we take for granted.
Yes.
It's something that is done in certainly my field in history, thinking about the American Revolution and its origins in the British Constitution, and then people trace that back to Rome and then go back to Greece, and then nobody else is sort of existing in that line. Yes. And this is supposed to be something called the West, which is synonymous in many ways with Europe and whiteness.
Yes. Well, I think there are
Whiteness in America, maybe not in Europe to the same way, because we've taken this to another level, but the West as a concept.
So one difficulty with trying to disentangle the things we say about the West is that we use it to mark so many. I mean, all of these things are best understood by thinking about West as opposed to what. And the as opposed to what part is different in lots of cases. So for, until the end of the Iron Curtain, it was as opposed to the Soviet East, right? There was Western and Eastern. Now, very often, it's as opposed to Islam, Islam, the world of Islam, and us, the West on the other side, where these are oppositions. Then, in the period after the First World War, which tore European societies apart, it was a horrible period of mass murder and dislocation and so on, Western civilization was invoked in order to try and bring the French and the Germans and the British, who'd all been killing each other in massive numbers, back together and think of something that they had in common. And so this idea was taken up at that point. There, it's the opposite. The opposition is kind of outside Europe. And America doesn't have to figure very much in that. But then later on, after the Second World War, we needed again to do a different job, which is to unite us against the East and the despotism of the Russians and so on. So one difficulty is just that we keep using it for different things, and it's a changing subject matter. But in all of these cases, it's useful to distinguish two things. One is the sense of culture in which, as I said, the Arnoldian sense, Matthew Arnold, the sense in which culture is novels and symphonies and rap music and stuff like that, but doesn't include what I call the Taylorian sense of culture, because Taylor, who was the first anthropology professor at Oxford, introduced this way of thinking about culture, which is everything socially transmitted. It's shaking hands. It's driving on the left. It's men wearing jackets and trousers and women wearing jackets and trousers. It's stuff like that. Now, when people talk about Western, especially Civ, they're not talking about culture in Tyler's sense. They're not talking about how people dress or accents and stuff like that. They're talking about Shakespeare and Goethe and stuff.
Accomplishments. So-called accomplishments that they mark off for one group of people and not the other.
And the fact is that the credit for Shakespeare should go to Shakespeare and anybody who influenced him. If you want to claim part of Shakespeare, what you need to do is to study him and work on it and make sense of it. You do not have to be a descendant of Shakespeare's or a descendant of Shakespeare's neighbors or a descendant of the people who lived in Shakespeare's England to do that. Some of the finest criticism of Shakespeare in the world today is done by Japanese scholars, just as some of the finest Buddhist scholarship now is done by people who aren't Indian, or for that matter Chinese, since Buddhism has been in China for a couple of thousand years. In that sense of culture, the idea of its belonging to any group or anything seems to me just a mistake. It belongs to the people who care about it.
Well, so you see it as a mistake. Then why do people do it?
Well,
because all of the things we're talking about, there must be some benefit that people have been getting from this.
Look, getting Shakespeare, Aristotle, St. Thomas, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Dickens, Jane Austen, and Virginia Woolf for free while not doing anything, that's a pretty good deal. If you're getting it all because you're white, that's kind of cool.
That's what I was saying. But I guess the reason I ask this is, how do you get out of this? Because obviously that is a really good deal to see yourself as a part of people who've done all these things, and you're sitting on the porch not doing anything yourself. Yes. I mean,
well, look, this is one of the ways in which this kind of investment in identity works for us, right? So you get to take pride in the achievements of your identity group, even if you have nothing to do with them. Yeah. This is true about families. I can be proud of my great-grandfather, let's say because he was involved in the creation of the League of Nations and therefore in the ancestry of the United Nations, which is true. But I didn't have anything to do with that. I mean, he was dead before I was born. I never met him, and I'm not sure what he would have thought of me. There are things about me that I'm pretty certain he'd had a hard time with. He wasn't a racist, as it happens, though, and that's unusual. I'm proud of that too, I suppose. But I don't think he would have been very relaxed about my being married to a guy. But nevertheless, so that's that. We do that all the time. I feel great when the Ghanaian team wins in the African Cup of Nations, an event about which most people in this room are completely oblivious.
Who cares?
I feel good about that. But I don't, they trust me, you don't want me on your side in a soccer match. So it's part of that phenomenon. And all I'm saying is that if you're going to do, and I don't care about that. What I don't want you to be allowed to do is to exclude people from, people may have different identity investments in the Mona Lisa, but everybody's entitled to look. And everybody's entitled to value it. And everybody's entitled to learn from these things. This is back to the point that the general point about identities, which is they can be used for good and for evil, and they're inevitable. So we can't get rid of them. We have to live with them, but we can modify them. We can think them, rethink them, and change them in ways that make them more adequate to fitting the lives of as many people as possible happily together.
Well, and you've done a service of putting all of these questions out there and starting this conversation, and I don't expect you to have an answer to this, so you'd be on your way to Stockholm to get your message, whatever. But what are the chances of overcoming this? You, at one point in the book, you express some mystification about the fact that Hindus might favor other Hindus versus Muslims. Does family have anything to do with this? You think about coming into a world where you have a set of people who are the world that you know, the community that you know, and you think of that as a unit, and then a community, and so forth. I mean, with something so, elemental, do we really have a chance of moving beyond clannishness?
So there are a couple of things that are helpful, I think, to remember when we're trying to deal with our own clannishness. Never mind the clannishness of all the others. Let's try and be better ourselves. One is you belong to many clans. Nobody belongs to just one clan. And the things that divide you from Joe include things. One lot of things, but there are things about you that unite you with Joe as well. And so I think that's one very important thought in our own sort of mental hygiene is to think when an identity is dividing you from somebody, is to think, wait a minute, can we find other things that don't divide us? Can we do that? And I think that is possible. Second thing is, for the identities that are salient in our society, we need to spend time with one another. It's not an intellectual grasp of the capacities of people of some other kind that makes it okay for you to sort of hang out with them. It's a being together. It's the experience of being together and just doing stuff. And that, one of the difficulties of our society is that there are too many groups of us where we've got an identity and we never spend time with people of the corresponding identities. Interestingly enough, I think there used to be somewhat more class in the United States. It's difficult to talk about class because people don't have a very well developed theory of class. One of the things I point out in the book is that people say that all Americans think they're middle class, but if you ask them, less than 50% of them say yes to middle class. A lot of people identify as working class, a lot of people identify as lower class, believe it or not, and a surprising 10% or so of Americans identify as upper class, which is a category that I thought was, British, and which I would never have claimed to belong to. I would have always said I was upper middle class in England. So I think that there are these lessons from social psychology that the experience of look, this was the genius behind the strategy of coming out for the lesbian and gay community in this country. If you don't know that you know any gay people, that's one situation. And then stories about gay people circulate. You don't have anything to check them back against, anybody you care about to check them back against. Now the world is full of gay people, for better or worse. There they are. They're in your office. Your dentist is gay. Your hairdresser surprisingly is straight, and so on. And so you discover these. You discover that actually the things people say about gay people just aren't true. Yeah. Also, when people say, queers, you think, okay, that's Mary and Jane over there. My neighbours, we have cookouts in the back. So I think it's really important to learn the lesson of that, and which means that if we've got a lot of salient identities in our society, we don't want them separated off from one another in social life. We don't want separate housing. We don't want separate neighborhoods, and so on. In Singapore, which I talk about in the book, they have actual state policy about this. Most of the housing in Singapore, you can buy it, but it's built by the state. And you can't, in every housing development, the ratio of Chinese to Malay to Indians to others has to reflect the total ratios in the population. Nobody's allowed to live in Chinese ghettos, and they're majority Chinese of Chinese ancestry. Nobody's allowed to live in Malay ghettos. Nobody's allowed to live in Indian ghettos, and so on. And it's worked in the sense, I don't mean that there's no inter-community problems in Singapore. There are, but it's worked in the sense that everybody knows people across these boundaries, and nobody thinks when you say Indian, oh, I don't know one of those. So you can say what you like about them. And because the Chinese community is mostly not Muslim, and some of the Indians and a lot of the Malays are Muslim, it means that, again, Muslims and non-Muslims know each other in this society, and so on. So the religious divide isn't able to be mobilized. So I think there's a kind of, and when I say doing things together, I mean just doing things together. I don't mean having intense and serious meetings about intergroup relations. That's another activity. I mean just doing things together. And if you're geographically isolated, if you're not in the same schools, and so on, you can't do that. So I think that one lesson of all this is that we need to make sure that all our major social institutions, like the armed forces, are integrated. Not because it's bad intrinsically to live in a community of people who are alike, but because in a multiracial society, for example, it's not good to have lots of people who don't know anybody of another race.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I think we're going to go to questions now. Someone has a microphone to over here. Raise your hands.
And this guy here.
Thank you. I'm very intrigued by the whole discussion, especially with regard to, and forgive me for dragging in current politics, but with regard to what you said about taking care of those people who don't have enough by, for example, the Republican and the Democratic parties. Research suggests that those people who voted for the current person in the White House did not vote for him because they felt economically distressed so much. They voted for him because they felt a loss of status. And I wonder if you could address yourself to the intractability of a problem like that.
So it's true that first of all, it's worth reminding ourselves that most people in the last election voted for one of the two candidates. There was a small number of people who voted for neither. Who voted. A large number of people didn't vote at all, of course. And therefore, the support for both candidates was an enormous coalition in both cases of people who were very diverse in lots of ways. But you're right that there is a subpart of the people who voted for Donald Trump who had previously not, well, some of them had previously even voted for Barack Obama, who seemed to be motivated by the sense that they had in this candidate someone who would deal with the loss of the sense of identity threat that some of these white people felt. Now, if the issue is that you want to hold on to a superior racial status, there's not much we can do about that, because that's wrong. It's wrong to have a society in which status is assigned to people, positive status is assigned to one racial group and negative status to another. That's wrong. So if that's the problem, then there's not much you can do about it except fight against it and try to get people to see that we live better in a society of equals, racial equals as well as every other kind of equal, than we don't, than in one that isn't. But if your sense of loss of status is in fact analyzable in part, not in terms of, indeed, not in terms simply of income or wealth, but in terms of a sense that you don't have a control over what your place is in the world, that you can't guarantee the transfer to your children of the advantages that you've struggled to get for yourself and so on. If that's the kind of status that you're losing, then the policies I was suggesting can help, because they can suggest to you that yes, you are a valued member of our society. Yes, the fact that you've lost a job and had to take a job that you think of as less important, for example, even though it's got you an income, it doesn't give you the same sense of meaning that you got from the old job. Those things we can do something about. We can't do something about them by denying the equality of some other group, but we can treat you as a worthwhile member of the community, treat your local community, your sub-community as a group of people worthy of respect and attention, and try to make sure that the things in your life that are getting you down, as long as it isn't simple loss of racial privilege, can be put right. And I think we can do that. So we can't meet, you're right that if what somebody wants us to return to or to take up is a politics that keeps in place the racial hierarchy of white supremacy, we of course we can't agree to that. And most of the white people I know aren't going to agree to that either. But if we say, look, if you're feeling, maybe your sense of loss of status is actually not relative to black people, it's relative to what you imagined it would be in a world in which the economy was going on the way you think it was going on when we were once great. And so you want to make us great again so that our economy will sort of look like that again. Now, we can't go back on those fronts, but I mean, the world economy has changed in ways that we can't simply do what the president appears to want to do, which is to kind of recreate a very, very expensive steel industry and make our phones cost, $5,000 a piece in order to produce jobs here. That's not going to work, and that'll be bad for most Americans as consumers, by the way. But we can think about new kinds of work. We can take seriously the possibility that we should be shifting our culture in the direction of recognizing that one of the things that people need sufficient amounts of is money, and that we should have a guaranteed basic income for everybody, independently of whether they've got a job or not. I mean, interestingly enough, that was thought to be ridiculous in many places a few years ago, but that universal basic income is now being talked about even in the United States. It's been talked about in other places for a while, and in Iran they've actually been doing it. So, which is a worry because it shows that universal basic income is clearly compatible with authoritarianism. But that doesn't make it bad. Having the railways run on time is compatible with authoritarianism, and that would be a good thing too. So I think we gotta there are things we can't compromise on, as it were, but I think there's a lot we can. And while I agree with you that the data doesn't support the view that it was, as it were, anxiety about the next meal that was driving that vote, I think there's no reason to doubt that there was a sense that the economy wasn't, because it's true, the economy has been, for most of the population, including most of the people we're talking about, giving them no real growth in wealth for a generation. And it has been producing growth in wealth at the other end of the income distribution, and that's unfair.
Hi, this is such a great conversation. So we can't get rid of identity, and I can imagine in my mind, and I think in all our minds, negative consequences of holding on to these identities. But can you talk more about how we can use our identities to benefit society?
Good. Well, first of all, that's a great question. First of all, let's start with the fact that they benefit us. I mean, the forms of so take nationalism. Nationalism can be terrible. It can lead to terrible things. But it can also lead to a society in which people think of each other as part of a shared enterprise and therefore is worthy of protection and support. It can lead, you need nationalism to create a great social welfare system, because you have to think that when I'm doing well, I'm willing to pay into a system which is helping the people who are not doing so well. But to do that, you have to think of them as us. It's not helpful to think of them as them. So when I'm down, if national identity does its proper work, I'm going to benefit from the support and attention of my fellow Americans, but also from the support and attention of my fellow Baptists, if I'm a Baptist, and my fellow Catholics, if I'm a Catholic, my fellow Jews, if I'm a Jew. There are lots of identities that can be used in this positive way. Also, when Ghanaians do great things, pumps me up. And when America does terrible things, it makes me feel bad. Even if they don't affect me in any direct way, right? And that makes me want to do something about it. That turns me into an active citizen. So I think these identity feelings mobilize, they can create solidarity, and they can just make you feel good, right? And in a world like this, feeling good is worth something.
Gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts on cultural appropriation. It seemed like you were saying that it's an acceptable practice so long as it's done respectfully. But for a lot of traditional cultural practices, any sort of innovation is innately disrespectful. So is that truly, a good dividing line for what should be an acceptable practice? And even if so, who gets to decide what is respectful and what is not?
Well, I think that I don't know what you mean by traditional practices.
My in-laws are Italian chefs.
Okay.
So there's a recipe for everything.
Okay. And they think that it would be wrong for a non-Italian to cook those things with those recipes.
Not necessarily for a non-Italian, but for a non-Italian to do the family lasagna in a different way.
So not only do they not want people not to...
This is a mortal threat for me.
Yes, right. Well, I'm sorry, but you can't have that. Unless you engage... So in Italy in the past, they protected cultural practices like that by killing people. So in Murano, as I mentioned in the book, the secrets of glassmaking were kept by making it a capital offense to reveal them. And of course, that didn't stop some Morenese going out and moving glass working into Germany and so on, but they tried. I think the question of who decides what's respectful in intercultural context is quite complicated. But I certainly don't think that it's okay for anybody to say to somebody else, hey, you don't respect me because you did something that I didn't like. Whether something's respectful or not depends on the attitude with which it was done. If someone knows that you don't want something done with some practice that you've acquired by interacting with them, and they then do it anyway, that might count as disrespectful. But my own view is that while it can make sense within a social group to have norms about how these forms of culture should be circulated, it doesn't make much sense to have rules that govern people once they've escaped from that social group and gone somewhere else. So I'll give you an example. I believe it's proper for museums that contain cultural artifacts from other societies, I believe it is proper for them to display them to all audiences. The fact that in the society it came from, women wouldn't have been allowed to look at it, or low-caste people wouldn't have been allowed to look at it, I don't believe constrains how museums should behave with respect to artifacts once they're in their possession. I know that there are people in those other societies who want them to stop women looking at them, and who want low-caste people to be kept out of the room, but I'm against that. So I don't think that the mere fact that a practice or a thought or a thing originated in your society means that you have a right to control everything that happens to it, especially when it goes somewhere else. So, you know, that's what I feel about Italian cooking.
We have time for one more question. Is there anybody in the front here?
Thank you very much. I come from Malaysia, and I have grown up with, studied with, lived with multiracial societies where we have an innate appreciation of our differences, and we respect each other for it. Now, having said all those, it appears to me that obviously identity, whether you are multicultural or not, you have to check it out as an awareness of your own individual happiness and your contribution to society. Having said all those, you have been quite idealistic in bringing up forth. We, each and every one of us, must have a sufficient amount of material wealth and resources so that we will live happily, hopefully happily, with those resources. Now, having said that, how do you envisage our political leaders to make people abide by this particular rule so that everybody can hopefully live happily ever after?
That's the live happily ever after question. So, I mean, I think that making multi-racial, multi-religious, multicultural societies work, I mean, the central question, I think, behind what you were saying is, what is the role of government and that kind of institution in this? And the answer is, I think, that we wouldn't tolerate in the United States the kind of active intervention in intercommunal relations that the Singaporeans engaged in next door to you, to you in Malaysia. But there are things that governments can do. Well, so and we wouldn't accept that, and that's fine because in this country lots of things can be done without the government. We don't need the government to do everything in the domain of culture. I was suggesting things that ordinary citizens could do, which include trying to mix and mingle a bit more than I think we typically do, especially outside the great cosmopolitan centers, that we can do that would help. But the state can do things. I think, some of the attempts at integration of our schools involve very active activity by the state. Those have somewhat fallen away now. But when they happened, I think they often did some good. And there are still communities in this country where if you reorganized, for example, the school districts, and in particular if you brought more city and peri-urban school districts together, you would get more integrated schools, and that I think would be a good thing. So that's a kind of role there. There's a role for local politics, city politics, or state politics, in trying to create more communities that are more interactive across these boundaries. So I think there is a role for the state. I don't think in this country, I think it would be, we've got a law professor here, so we can ask, but actually I'm a professor of law too, so. But I don't know any law, and she does. But I think it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult legally in this country to do many of the things that the government of Singapore does, and I wouldn't, I think, want them to. But it doesn't mean there's nothing that the state can do. And the other thing is that political leadership isn't just about commands. It's about tone. It's about the White House Easter egg roll photograph, what that looks like. I don't know if you looked at it this year. That's my last comment. So yes, there are things the government can do, but it's not just for governments. I think corporations have a role here. Integrated workplaces are a very important source of cross-identitarian experience. And we have evidence that workplaces that draw on people of diverse identities benefit from the creativity produced by people coming from slightly different backgrounds. So I think there are reasons for hope that beyond the state doing things, which, as I say, I'm not in favor of, though I don't think we should go as far as Singapore, there are other institutions of society, churches, corporations, and then each of us in our own lives can think of things we can do.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. This is wonderful.
Thank you very much.